Today, I'm going to give you the ultimate guide in calculating pain and suffering settlements. I'm going to teach you how to calculate pain and suffering. We're going to look at some past examples of pain and suffering payouts. I'm going to give you some advanced tips on calculating pain and suffering, and we're going to cover lots more. I've used these tips to get over $9 million in settlements, much of which included money for pain and suffering. I'm personal injury attorney Justin Ziegler. The average payout for pain and suffering in most personal injury claims is less than $15,000. The Insurance Services Office said that the average payout was $15,270 for bodily injury in car accident claims. The Insurance Services Office is the same entity that keeps track of all of your injury claims. When you look online or if you look at billboards and TV ads, most personal injury settlements or verdicts that you hear about do not tell you how much was paid for pain and suffering. They give you the total settlement amount. Here, I'm going to do my best to tell you how much each individual client received for pain and suffering. You may see billboards and see TV ads showing $300,000 settlements here and there, $1 million settlements, but that is not your average case. The average case is well under $15,000 for pain and suffering. In the average claim, you are not going to get $292,000 in pain and suffering like my client that you can see in the photo here. He was in a car accident, but he had a major injury. He fractured the bone right below his kneecap and had surgery. But that's not your average case. Most cases don't involve a fracture like his. You're typically going to get a much higher offer for pain and suffering if you have a broken bone and you've had surgery. In another case, my client was a passenger in Holly Hill, Florida in a car. Another vehicle was coming in the opposite direction and crashed into the car in front of my client's car, which then hit her car, and we settled the case for $33,000. $31,000 of the $33,000 settlement was for pain and suffering. We were able to get the settlement for several reasons. One, this was a very serious accident, and it was a head-on accident. The driver of the car in front of my client's car died. There was significant damage to the vehicle that my client was in. The news reporters came to the scene and had photos of my client being taken out of the vehicle that she was in by paramedics, and she ultimately went to the hospital and had an acetabulum fracture, which is a hip socket fracture. Now, she did not need surgery for that fracture, and she made a very good recovery, but due to the fact that there were so many people involved in this incident, the insurance company was quick to pay out the limits. I was able to settle Caesar's case for $20,000, and his injury was essentially whiplash, but the reason why we got $20,000, much of which was for pain and suffering, was because his car was so badly damaged. If we take his same exact case with the same exact level of treatment and there was no damage to his car, instead of $20,000, Geico may have offered $3,000. After my attorney's fees and costs and paying all of his medical bills, he received over $7,250 in his pocket. Always send before and after photos in each case when you're trying to build up your pain and suffering claim. The insurance company's first offer is likely not going to be their last offer. For example, in one case where I represented an Uber driver who was injured in an accident, the other vehicle's insurance company made me a first offer of $150,000. We ultimately settled his case for $260,000, so their first offer was not factoring in the full value of his pain and suffering. Surgery increases a pain and suffering payout. In 15 out of 16 of my biggest settlements, my clients had surgery. Without surgery, every case would have settled for a lot less. You may also get compensation for emotional distress or mental anguish. However, in most cases, the amount you'll receive for those is very small. Now, if you have a scar going across your forehead or a scar going across your entire face, the value of emotional distress can be large. Men usually get less money for pain and suffering than women. For example, I represented a client who was taking a shower and he shut the door and the glass exploded and sliced up his leg, and you can see a scar. We settled his case for $31,500. If we take the exact same case, except it was a woman that would have been involved, the settlement would have been larger. This is because adjusters believe that scars have a larger effect on women than men. When you're sending a demand letter to the insurance company, be sure to include photos of the damage to the vehicles involved, particularly if they are very badly damaged. You can see my client lying on the ground in this case. This was a great photo that we sent to all insurance adjusters involved in the case. We settled his case for $300,000, and again, most of his settlement was for pain and suffering. Insurance companies pay more for pain and suffering if you take an ambulance to the hospital. Just take a look at Uber's accident report form. One of the first questions they ask is, did you take an ambulance to the hospital? The same is true if you call any auto insurer and report a claim. They're going to ask you, did you take an ambulance to the hospital? If your car is totaled or sustains significant damage in the crash, you're likely going to get a higher award for pain and suffering. This is because the auto insurance adjuster knows that a jury is more likely to believe that you were injured and experienced pain and suffering if your car was badly damaged. On the other hand, if your car did not sustain much damage, don't expect a big payout for pain and suffering. Sure, if your car didn't sustain much damage and you have a broken bone, you're going to get a nice payout for pain and suffering most likely. But for your average case where you're claiming that your neck hurts, your back hurts, and you receive very little damage to your vehicle or the other vehicle involved, don't expect a huge pain and suffering payout. There are exceptions to this rule, such as if you're dealing with an out-of-state insurance company who pays better, or if you're dealing with one of the few insurance companies that pays well when there's minor damage to the car and your injury is whiplash, such as a Nationwide or Hartford. When you're dealing with Geico, Progressive, and State Farm, they are really cheap in offering pain and suffering compensation if your car did not sustain a lot of damage and your only injury is neck and back pain. Pain and suffering settlements are higher in certain counties than others. Typically, in liberal counties, the pain and suffering settlements are going to be higher. For example, in Florida, in Miami-Dade, Broward County, West Palm Beach, Orlando, the amount that you get for pain and suffering in one of these counties is likely going to be higher than if your accident happened in a small town in Florida. As an example, I represented a gentleman who fractured his fifth metacarpal, which is a bone in the hand, and Geico insured the other driver. My client ultimately had hand surgery, and we settled his case for $125,000. If we take that same case, which this case happened in Miami-Dade County, and we assume it happened in a rural county like Lee County in Florida or another small county, the settlement would not have likely been $125,000. It would have been less. Again, it's because conservative counties, you're generally going to get a lower pain and suffering award. In Florida, there's not a cap on pain and suffering. However, in most cases, you should send a demand letter to the insurance company asking them to make you an offer. I typically ask them to make a fair offer. I oftentimes do not give them a certain amount that my client will accept. I want them to make the first move. The number one way that you prove your pain and suffering in a personal injury case is going to be your medical bills and your medical records. Every time you go to the doctor is going to record your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10. The more pain you have, let's say it's a 9 or a 10, the higher award you're going to get for pain and suffering, all things equal. If you have a 1 or 2 level of pain, you're going to have a very tough time telling the adjuster that you are so badly injured and you want a huge amount of money for pain and suffering, yet you are only telling the doctor that your pain was a 1 or 2 out of 10 level. In many cases, attorneys end up dealing with the same adjusters over and over. So the attorney can look in his records and see how much a particular adjuster offers for pain and suffering. This can be very helpful. Let's take a look again at Caesar's case where we settled his case for $20,000. The reason why we got $20,000 as a total settlement is he had several factors going for him in his favor. He took an ambulance to the hospital. There was heavy damage to the vehicles involved. He followed the doctor's instructions and went to all the medical appointments, and there wasn't a gap in his treatment. There's a large gap in your treatment, you should expect a lower offer for pain and suffering. In Caesar's case, 69% of the total settlement was for pain and suffering. Some insurance companies will make a first offer without you making a demand. Others will require you to ask for a specific amount. I typically see this happen with large self-insured entities. In other words, companies that don't have insurance, they're paying out of their pocket. I've had cases where they will not make a first offer unless we make a specific demand for a specific amount. Some insurance companies offer more money for pain and suffering than others. Hartford, Nationwide, Hanover, and many others have a reputation for paying above average for pain and suffering. On the other hand, Progressive, State Farm, Allstate, Geico all have a reputation for paying below average for pain and suffering. If you're trying to settle your case before a lawsuit, a little bit of luck is involved. I represented an Uber driver and we settled his case against the other vehicle's insurance company for $260,000. In that case, CNA insured the other vehicle. However, if we had the exact same case and it would have been Geico, Progressive, Allstate insuring the other vehicle, the settlement would have been much less. Of course, we could take the case to trial. However, a lot of people don't want to go to trial because that involves increased expense. It typically takes a lot longer than a pre-suit settlement. However, there are some cases that need to go to trial. A common split in a personal injury case is the attorney gets a third of the settlement, the client gets a third of the settlement, and the other third of the settlement goes to medical bills and health insurance liens. However, there are cases where the client can get over half the settlement. I've had this happen several times. Ultimately, the trial court, if the case goes to trial, can reduce the pain and suffering award, or even if you win at trial, those cases can still get appealed, and the appeals court can reduce the case if it feels that the pain and suffering award was shocking. If you go to the hospital after an accident and you have a long stay there, it typically increases the amount of your pain and suffering settlement. For example, one of my clients, Ryan, was in a bad car accident in Clearwater, Florida, and we settled his case for $300,000. The fact that he stayed at the hospital for a long amount of time increased the value of his pain and suffering. The effect that the accident has on your life is going to tremendously affect your pain and suffering settlement. For example, if after an accident you end up in a wheelchair, you're typically going to get a larger award for pain and suffering. If you were a marathon runner and now you can't run marathons anymore, you're typically going to get more money for pain and suffering. Be sure to send the insurance adjuster photos of your medals, photos showing that you were a runner. The same thing is true if you played golf and you really enjoyed that. Show the adjuster how active you were before the accident and then send them photos of how you are doing now. You can even send them videos. The goal is for your case to come alive to the insurance company. You just don't want to be another file to the insurance adjuster. For more tips on maximizing the value of your personal injury case, click this video here.